This is a drawing that I did about 3 days ago, and I left it without starting to paint because within the intervening days I'd come in and make changes on the drawing. But now I'm pretty close to the end of what I'm doing, and where I'm simply, the changes have been made, and what I'm doing is now I'm going to, I used to work directly from nature, and the result is I was terribly influenced and I didn't design my pictures, so that now I work from drawings, from sketches, and then it gives me an opportunity to assemble the material, to adjust it, and not to be influenced by the effects of nature. So I find that my pictures I enjoy for much longer because they are carefully designed instead of affected by nature, although I do work directly from nature. The fact that I fixed this drawing now does not mean that that's the way it's going to stay. And there'll be some considerable changes when I start painting, but as far as I'm concerned, the design on this is enough to give me an opportunity to work, and there's absolutely no guarantee that the finished painting will look anything at all like this. And now I'm going to lay out my palette, which fortunately that I'm not a colorist is a rather inexpensive one. I use primarily earth colors, which are cheap. I don't use any cadmiums, yellows or reds or austere blues, which are expensive. So I work with basically a simple earth color palette, which is makes sort of sense because it's relatively inexpensive as far as materials are concerned. Since the cadmiums are anywhere from $4 to $5 to $6 a tube, I don't have to worry about those because the earth colors are anywhere from $1, $1.50. They used to be 30 cents, but now nothing is 30 cents anymore, so that's doesn't make very much sense. But it's an inexpensive palette, so I can afford to waste color, as you see I do very successfully. Just trying to think of what else I could say about not being a colorist, but I think that's obvious when you see my work. Essentially a tonal painter.
Why is it that your painting basically seems to deal with decay?
That's pretty much like that statement which is constantly being made. There's enough unhappiness in the world. Why do you paint pictures which are basically unhappy? And the answer, I haven't thought of an answer to that yet, but essentially, I don't paint decay, I paint the effect of man on landscape, and man doesn't always enhance it. When he enhances it, he does it by putting up rose bushes and trellises, and when he defaces it, he leaves used automobiles lying around in his front yard decaying. And those are the sort of experiences that I feel that I could use. And so I never thought of that I was dealing with decay, and nothing as profound or civilized decay of a civilization. I'm just talking about that nature in a peculiar, I have to see whether this is dry, whether the fixative has worked, because when I start my tone over it, I may lose my drawing, which would make a certain amount of trouble. So I'm doing this. You can stop this for a minute if you want to. It takes a second for the fixative to dry. This is simply a mixture of umber, blue, and some sienna. And the purpose of this is to get rid of the white so that whenever I put my first color on, I'm working against a tone rather than against white. Now, if I were a modern painter, I could leave it at this state and just simply sign it, but I'm not a modern painter, so.
So you describe this as a base.
No, I describe it as a kind of a traditional tone. For example, in the original period when underpainting was a common practice, if you were doing a landscape, you put on a warm ground, which immediately gave you, you see I'm getting rid of the canvas. So if I put a piece of white on there, I start what is known as a scale. And the theory behind that is if you're doing a landscape in which the color is cool, you put a warm reddish tone or veil or whatever you want to call it. And if you're doing a human figure which is warm, you place a cool color on your veil so that immediately you have something to work up against or to, whichever comes first. That should set for that turpentine, which is very volatile, to dry in an hour or two, and then I will begin laying in bits of color and then proceed, because now is really the beginning of my problem, having solved the first problem temporarily by making the kind of a drawing which I think the design will be effective. However, when this picture gets to certain stages, certain things may be eliminated, other things may be added, but the basic composition remains fairly much what it is. And I'm not going to try to paint. What I'm going to do is just simply clean up the palette here so that maybe later this afternoon, when I come back in here, it'll be dry enough so that I won't pick up the color underneath.
How did you come by this composition?
I had a drawing which I made. Well, I was really not a landscape painter until I came to Woodstock. And when I came to Woodstock, because I wanted to paint, had a problem in New York, I would spend all of my days going to movies with a stopwatch. And I had a beautiful job, worked in the library from 5 to 10 at night and on Sundays. So I had the whole day to paint, but I did very little painting. The painting I did was quite modern, quite avant-garde. I was in Cubism, I was involved in all kinds of things. And when I got up to Woodstock, I discovered the landscape. Although I must say that the landscape in Woodstock is not the most terrific that I've ever seen. But there was enough of it so that when I began, I had a period, and I won't mention the other painters whose name I won't use, painting practically 2 pictures a day, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And it would be done outdoors. We'd be in front of a barn or a tree or a bend in the road or something like that. And then it was wonderful, the enthusiasm I had. I worked like hell, and then I'd get home, and at night with the pictures that I had painted during the day, I didn't always do 2 of them a day. I had to have odd jobs, so some days I only did 1 a day. And I would, you know, do as much as get up in the middle of the night to look to see what I've done, and the excitement lasted approximately 12 to 20 hours. And within a week, the same pictures that I had done that had all that enthusiasm, I eventually had to destroy, because the influence of nature was so strong that if the shadow were on the left, or if there was a tree in front of something, or a rock was in the wrong place, I didn't design the landscapes that I looked at and just simply worked directly from it. I learned a hell of a lot about painting by doing that, but I never produced a picture which lasted more than a week or so before I realized it wasn't much use to me. I didn't realize that until after I had done this for about a year or so, and then suddenly I realized that I'm destroying more pictures than I paint. And so what I did was I stopped going outdoors with my equipment and the wind and the rain. And in the early days when you went down to Kingston to work in Rondout below a bridge, the natives who were uncultured at the time, now everybody is an art lover, would throw stones down at the people that sketched in the Rondout area, or the Glasgow brickyards, or wherever there was a subject that would interest a painter. Woodstock painters there wasn't anything, particularly in the summertime when everything is covered with a kind of a fuzzy green, and very little character, and in the wintertime it's too damn cold to put out an easel to paint the really beautiful tonalities of winter. Interest me much more than summer, although I enjoy living in the summertime much more than I do sliding around on ice in the wintertime. So I stopped this aggressive, fast painting, but that was really my learning period as a landscape painter, and decided that I would take notice of things as I passed in my car on the way to Kingston, a grove of willow trees, a broken down automobile, things hanging from trees, bird cages, poles stuck up, all the oddments that man does to decorate the nature he lives in. And I'd have certain spots picked out that I thought I would want to paint. And I had the experience of seeing them in bright sunlight on a rainy day, at dusk, covered with snow. It was very important to develop a kind of observation, which I think is useful for a landscape painter. And then when I got ready to make the painting of a spot that I thought would be my focal part of the picture, or the reason for the painting, I would then go out and make a couple of preliminary drawings or sketches, if need be, if I couldn't recall the... Usually I didn't do too much preliminary drawing because my visual memory was fairly good. And then I found that I would make the drawing, and I would take a great deal of care in making the drawing, because this time I was concerned with where I placed everything in relation to everything else. I even developed a sort of a formula, you know, 1/3 ground and 2/3 of sky. And I got tired of that formula after a while, but it gave me a starting point as a painter. And I would make the drawing and immediately begin painting on it after I got the drawing fixed. Same process that I use today, except I didn't wait to check my drawing. I find if you let something rest or cook for 2 or 3 days or even a week, you're bound to see the flaws, the weaknesses in it, and correct them before you begin painting. It's easier to correct a charcoal drawing than it is an oil painting, which takes time to dry. So then I began to paint from ideas and sketches that I had made, And I found a very interesting phenomena. I was just as excited about the paintings that I did then as I was when I was doing 2 of them a day. But these seemed to have a longer life. I could go back 3 months later and look at them and found that there really wasn't too much that I could have changed again. And then when I got to the point where I waited even longer and found that I had done pictures that were a year and a half old, I looked at them and thought to myself, well, there's really nothing now that I want to change in that picture. I may have destroyed it because it wasn't successful by my terms being very simple terms, a kind of self-indulgence, what I wanted to say about a particular area. And it wasn't always bright sunlight with jingle bells and roses and beautiful objects. That accounts for the fact that I paint wrecked automobiles. I did a number of pictures of houses that were burnt down with chimneys. And I got the usual kind of crap you get from people about, you know, there's so much ugliness in the world. Why not just do beautiful things? I don't think in terms of ugly, I don't think in terms of beauty. I think in terms of what it is and how it can be incorporated into a landscape and have a kind of reality that doesn't exist in reality. So if I pass by and I see an automobile tire hanging from a pole, which may have been somebody's swing and they raised it up because the kid is too old to swing on the tire and it's been left hanging there, I use that as an item in maybe another picture. I mean, I cannot point to a single picture and say, this is where I was standing when I painted this. I don't identify, this was done on the other side of Lake Hill or Shady, and those are all areas within driving distance of here. That's why I mentioned them. If somebody in San Francisco is listening to this, they might wonder where the hell Shady is, or Bearsville, but
Names of places.
those are names of places. That's a very good point. Yes, I've been called a surrealist, and I must say that there's nothing about the subconscious, because I think with my conscience. I don't know what the hell goes on in my subconscious. I'm not
so much in that aspect, more in the relationship of art objects.
I think I like the principle of surrealism, which is that the idea of objects in relative positions which create not a compatibility but a contrast is a useful thing. I mean, I'm not a surrealist, so I wouldn't paint a baby carriage filled with automobile tires, but I like the incongruity of placing a lemon in the middle of a landscape, or a tree in the middle of a lemon, or that sort of thing. The people that think of my work as having a surrealistic element are usually people that don't know too much about surrealism or any other kind of ism. And any incongruity, is that how you say it? Any incongruity in the relationships of my objects appears so realistic, because that's a term that they think is suitable for it. I do use devices and cliches, poles when I need uprights, when I need movements, signs, ribbons, lines. These are not necessarily my own cliches, but you will find elements in almost every picture of things that where I need them. And I remember a man who was a important painter, photographer, and artist in this community, Konrad Kramer, who is as German as you can get, said to me, when you look at your painting and you discover that right here is exactly where you need a vertical or a horizontal, don't put it there. Put it an inch either side of it. Don't make it obvious. not only don't make it obvious, but he went as far as to do something which I could never do in my life, but I learned from that. He said, take a piece of glass and paint that pole or that whatever it is and hold it on the picture and move it around. Well, bullshit, I don't have to do that. I can visualize. So that when you look at a painting, and most people don't look at them this way, but when another painter looks at it, he says, yeah, that movement there is very, very important. If he sees that it's placed there because it's important, it loses its effect that I'm trying to create.
Mystery, in a sense.
So, I'm now quoting Kramer again. If you need an upright right exactly there, don't put it there. That's a lesson, you know, what the hell. I like to think of myself as a minor poet.
Because they're very literal in a sense.
Yes, and they also create a mood.
That's why you don't need color.
I'm self-conscious about color. I use it. I use color so that it loses its meaning as color. I'm essentially a tonalist. I'm interested. I would love to be able to paint a complete picture in black and white. It would have to, for me, the range of tonalities that a palette of 32 brilliant colors would not have. I find that in this country particularly, colorists are extraordinarily rare. I don't know if this country's ever produced more than a handful of colorists. No, but I mean, people who use color generally use it very badly. If they use lots of reds and lots of blues and lots of yellows and lots of purples, what they do is they don't make a distinction because a red and a blue of the same value would cancel each other out. Doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense to me. So that a man who uses a great many colors is not really using colors, he's using values which are similar of red and yellow and blue and green and whatever other colors there are, and it's not a colorist. A colorist is a man that moves colors back and forth in space, and I doubt if I could mention more than half a dozen people that are colorists, and that also does not necessarily include a recent category of painters called color field painters, because those colors have neither shape nor form, they just simply become colors, so that I have no objection to people being color field painters, but I find that without any kind of anchor to reality, those pictures mean very little to me.
Can you tell me something about how, yourself, your background, how you became a painter, what made you become a painter?
Oh yeah, that's a terrible story, but I hope you only use part of it.
Okay.
I was very much interested in reading. I learned to read before I learned to paint. And I did all kinds. I started reading garbage, which developed a habit of reading. I read all of the detective stories in the Chicago Public Library. I read all of the Nick Carter, Horatio Alger things. And then when I got to the more German romantic novelists, I was also very much concerned with sensation, having experiences. I wanted to have every experience you could have. In those days, you couldn't get any drugs, so I wasn't interested in the drug experience. I matured late sexually before I found out what great ecstasy that was. But in reading novels, I always experienced a passage in some romantic novel where the Duchess of Pozzuoli-Vuccia rode in a dusty carriage for 3 hours to a small chapel in a village, where she entered the chapel and there, transfixed by the experience of Puccini's Madonna, had an ecstatic aesthetic experience that lasted for 3/4 of an hour, and I thought, gee, that would be a wonderful experience for me to have. Since that was available, we had museums, we had pictures like that. So I showed up at the Chicago Art Institute and began looking at the pictures. And I must say that it did not create that aesthetic experience, because I would look at a painting, it would be a lady with a shawl holding a basket of fish in her lap or some other object, and it would simply be a picture of a lady holding a basket of fish. I was not transfixed by any great emotional thing that you're supposed to experience in presence of the Botticelli paintings. But because that experience didn't come quickly and easily, I kept going back to the Chicago Art Institute, and I kept getting interested. I began to prefer one kind of picture to another kind of picture. And I had a job which was in the neighborhood. I could walk to the Art Institute during my lunch hour. So I spent an awful lot of time, and I began to make distinctions. Which I preferred. They had a very good modern room. They had Renoir, they had a Birch Bartlett collection, they had the Grand Jatte, they had Séganzac, they had Van Gogh, they had Matisse, they had Braque in one room, and then a whole room full of it was really an experience that absolutely, I think it's one of the best museums in the United States. So that's how I got, plus reading. I then began to read about. There were very few people that wrote about painting, and the people that wrote about it were not as popular. I mean, the whole idea, you must realize this happened 60 years ago, or 55, I don't know how many years ago. And so my age was very much involved with Cézanne. That was the modern painter. He was the Andy Warhol of his day. And then when I read Willard Huntington Wright, the brother of the guys whose detective stories I used to read, he said something which kind of stopped me temporarily. He said, it's not good enough to paint as well as Cézanne paints. You have to paint better than he does. And I thought, well, you know, what the hell? I would have been very glad to settle for what he did. And that, plus Chicago had a Bohemia, had something called the Dill Pickle Club, where you saw very, very bad, I now know very bad modern paintings. It was part of the literary scene in Chicago near the Newberry Library. It's called I forget what the area is called. The square in front of the library was called Bughouse Square. That gives you an idea. That was the equivalent of the Greenwich Village of New York. And a friend of mine would go to the Dill Pickle Club, and we'd walk around the near East Side trying to figure out in which houses artists lived, if we saw an easel in the window or something like that. It was very romantic nonsense, had nothing to do with painting. And then we both decided we would try to do it. So we went to a stationery store and bought those little tiny tubes of oil paint and a brush and one other thing, and we made textures. We bought only one color because they were about 28 cents a tube or something like that, so you don't fool around. So we squeezed it out, and with a brush we made little brush marks and stuff like that. Well, that really wasn't a hell of a lot that you could learn doing that. But that's what we started with. And then I got more colors, and then I decided that I was going to be a modern painter. So I got half a dozen colors instead of one color. And I was building radio sets at the time, so I had Bakelite that you use for the panels. Is this too much of this crap? I got some Bakelite and used that as a palette. And the first thing I remember painting was upright telephone, the kind you pick up and hold the receiver to your ear. The receiver? Yeah, the receiver, and that kind of a telephone. You cut in a picture of that kind of a telephone. And I made it out of little different colored triangles and squares and circles, and then painted in the whole background very something. It was kind of a ridiculous thing because it wasn't Cubism. It had nothing to do with Cubism. It had nothing to do with any kind of painting that was being done at the time. But it was modern, as opposed to painting a telephone which looked like a telephone. So I decided that I was going to get a lot of flack from people who said, oh, you're doing that because you can't do the other thing. So then I decided I will show them that I can do the other thing. I was going to go down to the Art Institute and enroll and learn to paint an academic portrait. And having accomplished that, I was going to put the academic portrait in my closet and continue painting things with little triangles and circles. And somebody said, oh, you're doing that because you can't do the other. I say, hold it. I'd open the closet door and say, see, I did this. Fuck you. That kind of thing. So I got into the Art Institute, and that's a story in its own, which is something about education, which I later became a professor teaching other people to become painters. And I was amazed on how much little drive they had. Well, when I wanted to do that, I went to the Chicago Art Institute in the middle of the day, and I said, I want to come here to learn to draw and paint. Started a very nice talk, first art criticism I ever received, explaining that the light on the velvet was a cool light, and where there was no light, it was warmed up. And by introducing alizarin crimson into the blue, I could make it recede into the dark, because the way I had painted the drapery was white and blue, and where it got light, I put more white in it, and where it got darker, I put more blue in it, and it obviously wasn't creating any kind of illusion at all. And by his explanation and the demonstration on my canvas, suddenly opened up. Suddenly I began to see the fold that I had painted was really going back. And he must have spent about 20 minutes with me. And then he said, you know, you can't go in this class. This is an advanced class. And, So I packed my little things and I went home early that day because I didn't go back up to the drawing class. And that's how I started. Later on, I went out landscape painting with a guy out in Forest Park, all doing landscapes, but he was also not a very good teacher. He explained to me that we were painting the sand dunes. He said, the sky, the sun is pink, and when it hits the sand, where the light doesn't hit it, it's cool, so that's blue, and then that's how you get purple. So he had some vague theory about Impressionism, which I don't think he understood, but that's perfectly all right because I didn't understand it either, but I did what he wanted me to do, and it worked out fairly well. After I got through with my experience at the Art Institute, I then got in to know a number of painters and got more involved, started seeing other exhibitions besides the ones at the Institute. And of course, the group of people, the fringe that I dealt with in Chicago, were all people who had had the most ecstatic experience in the world, had all been to New York at one time, not all of them, but the important ones had been to New York already. So the objective of everybody in Chicago was to get to New York. So that became my objective too. Well, I was fairly sophisticated. I saw a show at the Chicago Arts Club in the Wrigley Building of Walt Kuhn and Kunioshi. I was fascinated by Kuhn's painting much more than Kunioshi's, which was the primitive period. And I was determined I would go study with Walt Kuhn because I liked the heads that he did. He did heads of women, which are beautifully painted. So I got to Chicago, I got to New York, and of course I went to the Art Students League. That's where Walt Kuhn was teaching. And I got there and I said to the lady, I want to register for the Walt Kuhn class. She said, Mr. Kuhn has stopped teaching since last year. I was a year too late. Would you like to try anybody else? I said, well, I'd like Boardman Robinson's class. She says, well, Boardman Robinson's class is full. You can't have Boardman Robinson's class. So then I thought to myself, gee, you know, I'll study with Kenneth Hayes Miller. She says, oh, that class is full too. I said, well, she said, why don't you go up to Tom's class? And I said, Tom who? She said, Tom Benton. She says, go up there. I'll put you into Tom's class. A very informal kind of thing. So I went up to the top floor to Tom's class. And I walked in, a very small studio. I walked in, and there I saw a revelation. Tom, fortunately, wasn't there. I saw a revelation. A black model, a man called Hunter, on the stand, posing with a spear, standing up. And on the canvases around, they had him looking out of a window and wearing a top hat and doing everything. Same kind of a portrait class in Chicago that I had visited but never had gone into consisted of someone sitting in front on a chair with an army blanket behind him, and at 20 canvases in the room, the army blanket and the wrinkle was exactly in the same spot in all 20 pictures. So when I came into Tom's class, I said, freedom, you know, liberty, creativity, all those wonderful, wonderful aesthetic experiences of creativity surging through. So I got little scraps of canvas, and I painted the standing figure, badly drawn, with all of the Matisse decoration that I could remember from the Matisses that I had seen in Chicago. And of course nobody paid any attention to me, particularly the monitor. And the monitor was painting part of the torso in sienna and white, doing the muscular structure of the body. I didn't know who the monitor was. I just gave him my card when I came in. And the day arrived when Tom showed up. He's a short-statured man, and he walked in this crowded classroom between all of these people, leaning over them, going mumble, mumble, mumble to them. I couldn't hear what he was saying to them. And as he walked from one to the other, mumble, 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 he eventually got to me. And I took out these three little tenuous efforts that I had done in his absence of the three little fraudulent Matisses. And Tom raised himself to his full height and at the top of his lungs said, "Young man, why don't you stop fooling around and get to work?" As compared to what the guy in Chicago had said to me, I thought to myself, you son of a bitch, you've humiliated me in front of all of these people. I was shy, I was sensitive, not sensitive enough to break into tears. But I said, this son of a bitch did this to me, humiliated me in front of a bunch of students that I didn't even know, because I was not more than 2 days in that school. And the wonderful thing about the league is that you could go downstairs and say, I don't want to study with that son of a bitch, get me somebody else. But I didn't do it. He wanted me to get a newsprint pad, he wanted me to get a can of shellac, some burnt sienna and white, and do what the monitor was doing, which was to try to get the structure part of the body, which had to do with my lack of drawing and everything else. The monitor, incidentally, was somebody, Jackson Pollock, I think was his name. He later became quite well known. And he said, sure, that's what I want you to do. So I stayed in Tom's class and I did that. Eventually, Tom and I were in the same gallery in New York. This was later. I didn't stay with him too long because I came back to Woodstock to paint. But I never liked Tom because he had humiliated me, embarrassed me, done something terrible which you do to a young person. But I was determined never to humiliate a student in front of his classmates, but always take him out into the hall to do it. I thought that would have, it turned out after I got to teaching, it turned out that the students weren't that sensitive. I could have humiliated and they would have simply struck me or something. They didn't used to do those things in the old days. So it's so much for what is known as my education. It was pretty spotty and pretty haphazard, and within the spottiness and haphazardness, I think accounts for my limitations as a painter, why I'm simply stuck with what I'm able to do and why I'm not given to experimenting and trying new things and inventing new devices and doing new color schemes and having a different way of looking at the world. I'm afraid that I don't have the equipment to do that, and if I try to do it, I know that I wouldn't succeed when I start. I would have to work at it for years. I particularly like the idea of being a figure painter. I would have liked to have been able to paint almost anything I wanted to paint. But now I found myself ending up by simply painting what I'm able to paint and hoping that the way I'm doing it is getting better, the communication becomes a little more profound. I have contributed nothing new to art, quote.
Sounds like a lot of regret there.
Oh no, it doesn't regret. It's a life that enabled me to do the things that I most enjoy doing. I mean, if I had succeeded, it would have given me a great deal more confidence and everything else, but absolutely no regret whatsoever. I don't make pretensions to greatness. I don't even use the term artist if I can avoid it, unless I'm, answering questions at the Motor Vehicle Bureau. It's to my profession. I'm essentially a painter. If somebody else thinks I'm an artist, that's fine. I would, I think the word artist today has such a loose, sloppy meaning that almost everybody is an artist. If you go out and dig a hole in the ground or kick a tree or think of something without even putting it on paper, you're performing a creative act. I don't use that kind of language. I don't use creativity. I don't use art. I don't use the term artist, except, if somebody in the garage asks me what I do, I tell them I'm an artist, because if I told him I was a painter, he would say, well, do you paint houses, or, that kind of thing. So I don't know that makes me any different than other painters, but the word painter implies to me that one does something, one paints. Whether he does it well or he does it badly, he's doing something. But when the term artist gets you into a metaphysical thing such as creativity, the mere act of walking in the woods and kicking a tree can become a complete creative act. I don't say it becomes a complete creative act, because I can't define things like that. But I have made no contribution to the history of art. I haven't moved it ahead 1 inch by adding a new point of view, a new color, a new structure, a new shape, a new form. I don't know. Well, the answer is, if I didn't do all of those things, why do I keep doing them? And that's a question I'm not really prepared to answer.
How did you come to Woodstock?
I was working at the New York Public Library in Science and Technology. Beautiful job for a painter. They wanted me to go to library school, which was kind of interesting. I didn't go to library school. I found that my painting, that the city provided too many diversions for me to really be serious about painting. By this time I knew that painting was a serious thing. It wasn't just things you did to jolly yourself along. And so being both sophisticated and naive at the same time, that's a rather unusual combination, I thought that I would come to an art colony. Now, I had heard of art colonies in Chicago where people used to go out and paint the sand dunes and stuff like that. I'd known of only 2 art colonies after I came to New York, and one of them was in Woodstock and the other one was in Provincetown. So I decided I would go to an art colony. Well, you know, you're going to be an artist. At that time I was, by the way, I was still thinking that that's what I wanted to be, an artist. The fact that I ended up as a painter is pretty damn lucky as far as I'm concerned. I thought the best place to end up as an artist would be in an art colony, so I decided I would come to an art colony. So I quit my job at the public library, very good job, and I had, I think, $3 or $4 or something like that, which that time was a lot of money. Decided I would head for an art colony. I knew that both of them were north of New York City. So I started hitchhiking. I don't know how I got across the Hudson River, or whether I got across the Hudson River or got across wasn't any Zuider Zee Bridge, but I found myself in Poughkeepsie, which was much further west than Cape Cod. And I spent the night in the police station in Poughkeepsie, sleeping in the, with the hobos and stuff like that. And the next morning, the hobo story is a very interesting story. When somebody does my life completed with illustrations and 700 pages of prose, I will tell about this experience in the police station. It had absolutely nothing to do with this videotape, but it's for your edification, you being the man behind the glaring light. I got to Woodstock. I had about $1.50 left of the money that I had started with. And I had, it was rainy, it was in the spring, and where Vasco Pini's frame shop was a restaurant there. Long before there was the Horseshoe or the Golden Rail or all of the other things that were there. There was a restaurant there, the only restaurant I think in town at the time. I went in there and I had a tuna fish salad, which was the cheapest thing. I think it was 60 cents, a piece of pie and a cup of coffee or something. That left my total funds to something like 80 cents left over. And then I walked back into town from Vasco Pini's, and where the church is, the church there was a shed in which people used to put their horse and buggies in when they came to church. It's approximately across the street from Pepper's Garage or something. You know, I don't even know the name of that church. I said to myself, that's where I'm going to sleep, in that, in one of those open three-sided things where you can go someplace else and get a picture of a place like that, cut it in. And before doing that, I thought it was still daylight. I thought I'd ask somebody where Arnold Blanche lived, because I was told by somebody in New York, go see Arnold Blanche in Woodstock. He's the, you know, the chief of the young tribe Mavericks. They didn't tell me to go see Spiker or McPhee or Klitgard or any of those people, but they sent me to Blanche. And so on my way to checking out the place that I was going to spend the night, I stopped and said to a young man, can you tell me where Mr. Arnold Blanche lives? And he said, I can't tell you where he lives, but I'll take you to a man who knows where everybody lives. I said, I must have said Arnold Blanche, the artist. So I got into his car, and he deposited me at Hervey White's house. He says, you go in there and you ask him. He'll tell you where Arnold Blanche lives. And then when you want to come back to town, I'll wait for you outside. I forget the exact details. I went in to Hervey White's place, and I said, I'm a young artist. I think I may have used the word artist at that time. And I've come up to Woodstock, and I was told to contact Arnold Blanche. And that's why I'm here. So Hervey says, Mr. Blanche, or Arnold Blanche, is ill. He can't see anybody. But if you want to stay here, you can stay here, and when Mr. Blanche is well, you can go over and see him. So I went outside and I said to the guy, I found everything I want. Thank you for bringing me over here. And I went back to Hervey White's. So he had a couple of other guys living there that did work around the Maverick, the Barnes boys. And we all slept in the attic in different beds, an unlined attic. There was no running water. There was no toilet. There was, I think the only artist on the Maverick that had a bathroom in the house was Karl Walters, the successful ceramicist. So I went to bed that night, and I heard things flying in the attic. Now, being a city boy, I figured out that they may be bats, and that they get into your hair, which is a fallacy. The bats not really crazy about getting into people's hair. So that first night I spent mostly under the covers to prevent the bats from getting tangled with my hair, which was much longer than it is now. And in the morning, at dawn, what appeared to be dawn, because the city was a late sleeper, we all got up and went out, starch naked in our birthday suits, to the stone porch there. And since I was the last arrival there, I was supposed to take 2 buckets full, go down to the spring and fill them with cold water, because we were going to all take a sponge bath. I wasn't particularly crazy about taking cold sponge baths, but you know, under the circumstances, it certainly, you know, here's a guy letting me live here. He's going to feed me. And the least I can do is take cold sponge baths in return. Now, that was part of the ritual. And the theory was that I would stay there until the rainy season stopped. Then I would go and fill with the 2 Barnes brothers all of the potholes in the Maverick Road. Now, Hervey was a Tolstoyan who believed, had very curious ideas. He was a writer. He printed his own novels. He was also, I think, although I don't know for sure whether he was a vegetarian or not, but we lived mostly on grated carrots and cabbage and stuff like that. And of course, in that particular time, I didn't realize it until much later, that in Woodstock, no two seasons are ever the same. It is either the coldest spring, the wettest spring, the driest spring, the snowiest spring, and this goes for all of the other seasons. No two, you can't compare spring in 19 so-and-so with spring in 19 so-and-so. Well, this particular spring, it rained every day for something like 33 days, so we couldn't work on the road. And then he gave me a little shack called Roney's Stable, and then I started getting jobs around doing dirty work at the going rate, which was about 50 cents an hour. And I couldn't spend the winter there, so I went back to New York, and then next year I came back determined that I was going to live in Woodstock, and I arrived and rented a place behind what is now called the Espresso, which used to be the Nook. Down about 4 little houses there, and I got a little house. The rent was $100 a year. I'm putting that in for people who are now paying $250 for a one-room efficiency in Woodstock. $100 a year. And that's how I got to Woodstock. And Woodstock was a wonderful, very, very strange place. There were natives and there were artists. The natives had very little to do with the artists had very little to do with the natives. There was no hostility between them. I discovered that you went to the post office every day. If you went to the post office in the summer, nobody paid any attention to you. But if you had spent a winter in Woodstock and had gone to the post office in the wintertime, then the next winter you spent there would mean that the natives, not the artists, would say howdy to you because they figured you weren't visiting, you had spent 2 winters there, which came under the heading of an accomplishment, a major accomplishment. I did something very stupid here, which I normally don't do. This is not a thing of how to paint a landscape. This is how I paint. But because this is the first time that I've worked with a camera, I wanted to save certain things and I began painting around them, which doesn't make very much sense. I did that because whoever is looking at it is got to remember all of these things. I have a drawing so I can refer to it. So this is not really the way I paint. This is the way I thought I would have to do it for the camera, which is ridiculous, painting in between all of these little items. What I'm going to do in a few minutes is cover all of these things here so I can have a completely wet sky and work into it as a wet painting. And all of this stuff is going to be lost. I put in details like this, which normally don't come in at this stage of the game, because I was aware of the camera business.